Hello! So for our next session, we produced a podcast instead of a video in which we will explore the genre of graphic novels and their relation with the visual history and memory of the Holocaust. It's an interactive podcast, so throughout the podcast you will be requested to browse, open, watch and read visual materials, which we will discuss here in our conversation and which we will also go back to in our class discussion. The folder for it is available for download on Moodle, but please download it before you listen to this episode of the podcast so that you can immediately engage with the visual materials. Our guest in this special podcast today is Lital Henig, and she's a PhD student from the Department of Communication and Journalism and an expert in graphic novels. Her PhD project is about the exploration of new forms of participation in Holocaust commemoration projects in interactive digital media ecologies. But she's also a member in the Visual History of the Holocaust research project, and in this project she's focusing a lot on graphic novels and their relation to Holocaust memory, and especially visual references to the Holocaust that are part of these graphic materials. Hello Lital, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me about your research.
Hi Tobias, it is so good to be here, and hi to all of the students.
Yeah, it's really good to have you here. I think it's also good for the students that they hear a different voice than mine. So you actually prepared a lot of interesting insight into the world of graphic novels for this podcast, so we should start immediately. And maybe we start with the basics. Lital, what exactly are graphic novels, and why and how can we relate them to the Holocaust?
Okay, so graphic novels are a genre of books, which some also consider as a medium, and the genre was first defined and extensively developed in the second half of the 20th century, as more and more graphic novels were published in various forms, countries, and topics from various authors. Although it's sometimes regarded as quite a niche genre, graphic novels actually have major implications on the visual memory of the Holocaust, as we shall see in this class. And historically speaking, the term graphic novel was coined in 1964 by Richard Kyle in his essay on the future of comics. A few linguistic attempts were done in order to come up with a proper name for illustrations that were neither comic nor necessarily presented in the form of strips, which also addressed an older audience of readers. And amongst the attempts to name these visual stories, the terms illustories, comic book strips, and picto-fiction were brought up, while Kyle actually dismissed all of these terms and proposed instead the term graphic novel. And he drew this term. Yeah, it's very cool, right? Graphic novel.
Yeah, really, especially to think about it as a in relation to the genres or to the names that were used before. It's already kind of turning it into the kind of serious world of literature through a term like that. But it's interesting what you say, that this already happened in the 1960s.
Yeah, exactly. We all the time think that it's kind of like a not serious and very niche genre, but it does has its origins. And he proposed the term drawing from the Merriam-Webster dictionary of the time, the definition of what graphic was back in those days in the 1960s, and it was pertaining to the arts of painting, engraving, and any other arts which pertain to the expression of ideas by means of lines, marks, or characters impressed on a surface. And as we know, his term was widely accepted, and this means that originally the term of graphic novel was focused on the materialistic and artistic impression of expression on a surface, and on the painting and engraving, these kind of crafty acts of an expression, more than on the acts of illustration or fictionalized experience.
That's really, really interesting. Especially when we think that often the emphasis is on novel, and then we think of literature, but that for him it was much more important to really kind of take the real meaning of graphic in the material and in the kind of artistic sense. That's really, really interesting. But yeah, so this also relates to to a specific, or to the perception which you already referred to, of the graphic novel as a particular medium, which is somehow distinct from others. Um, John Bettens, a cultural studies scholar, he characterized the graphic novel in contrast to the comic book by defining 4 features. He spoke about form, about content, about the publication format, and the production and distribution aspects. What does it mean?
So I think that he is actually I really like his writing on graphic novels because he regards them in medium and kind of like finds a new in the graphic novels, kind of estranges what we think of as something that is very common in graphic works, and rethinks them. And I think that his characterizations of form and content are probably most important to our exploration of the graphic novel. And in terms of form, Bettens claims that graphic novelists are craving for a recognizable style, and they're trying to turn away from comics conventions, breaking the conventional rules which characterized the comics field in the 1960s and 1970s, such as working with unframed panels and creating more fluid dialogues between various images. They also challenge narratives either by refusing to it or by emphasizing a dimension of storytelling that was hardly prominent in comics.
I understand. So this also brings now the dimension of the narration, so to say, into the whole context, and I think this relates also to the fact that the narrator is much more present in graphic novels, verbally, of course, through a kind of more conscious form of narration, but also visually. In many graphic novels, we already see the artist or a narrator who tells the story. So this is a distinction to the comic, where the story usually kind of seems to tell itself without a specific narrational intervention, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Bettens also defines the content of graphic novels as adult content, which means that he regards it as a serious and sometimes also sophisticated content. And in addition, a lot of graphic novels are also autobiographical or semi-autobiographical, and several of them also claim to portray reportage or history. Other graphic novels are more object-oriented, and they may qualify as journalism or history writing rather than autobiography. And altogether, the ability of the graphic novel to incorporate a first-person narrative and oral history, as well as to introduce fiction with historical meaning and vice versa, is what makes it so fascinating and such an important body of work.
Okay, so this explains also already why there is this interesting connection between the genre or medium of graphic novels and Holocaust memory and testimonies. That also this biographical and autobiographical aspect, but also this kind of way of engaging with history and histories. We will go back to that in a moment. But first, please tell me, Lital, when did that start, that the Holocaust became a topic in graphic novels?
So I think we can point on 3 major turning points regarding graphic novels and the Holocaust. The first turning point is the major collection of illustrated survivors' booklets.
So here comes the first task. So please take a look at the figures 1, 2, and 3 in our visual folder. For these images taken from the Ravensbrück booklet, which was published around 1946. Just get acquainted with these images.
So these booklets, like the Ravensbrück booklet, were drawn after liberation by Holocaust survivors, and they were disseminated in small communities of survivors, and especially in the Soviet Union. And one of these booklets is called, as we just know, Ravensbrück, and we can see it portrays the everyday atrocious experiences of female prisoners in the Ravensbrück concentration camps. And the illustrations that we are now looking at are taken from there. And as you can see, these booklets mostly portray subjective experience of survivors, and they were regarded as preliminary testimonies drawn by survivors. And Art Spiegelman, which we will talk about in a few minutes, regarded those drawings as a return to drawing, not for its possibility of imposing the self, of finding a new role for art and drawing after the invention of the camera, but rather a return to the earlier function that drawing served before the camera, a kind of commemorating, witnessing, and recording of information, this kind of I saw, I was there.
That's really interesting that actually the ancestors of the graphic novel started with drawing the experiences and using the drawing pen, so to say, as an instrument of witnessing the actual experiences of survivors. But on the other hand, this explanation I think also very well corresponds with the definition you already gave, Kyle's definition of the graphic novel as this kind of materialistic, artistic expression of an impression, which really makes it maybe specifically suitable for expressing the experiences of survivors after the war. And I think this is an ongoing topic in graphic novels about the Holocaust.
Yeah, for sure. And although they're not considered as a graphic novel, these booklets also later influenced the works of younger generations, as we shall see soon. But before we delve into the works of second generation born after the Holocaust, another pioneer in the field of Holocaust-related graphic novels is the 1955 8-page story about the Holocaust, L. Feldstein and Bernard Kirgistein's Master Race.
So please pause again and read Master Race, the figures 4 to 10 in our visuals folder.
So Master Race portrays a post-war encounter between an anonymous man and a former Nazi soldier in the New York City subway, delving into flashbacks and portraying various events, images, and places we know from the history of the Holocaust, amongst them Kristallnacht, gas chambers, camp medical experiments, and mass graves, amongst other horrors of Nazism.
Oh wow! Okay, so this was a short story comic, which nevertheless addressed the Holocaust seriously, and that already happened in the 1950s.
Yep. And we can see that it is characterized by a unique, definitive style, very much stressing movement and rhythm, and it almost looks like shots taken from film footage, stressing the changing movement between the images.
Ah, okay, and that's also why they remind us of some of the film footage that we already know. We also discuss it in class, a lot of kind of images, film footage that relates to the history of the Holocaust. Please take a few minutes and try to relate photographs and footage which you know from the liberation of the Holocaust to Master Race. Save these references and present them in class in our coming discussion.
So, both the booklets and Master Race were very much influenced Art Spiegelman in creating Maus, which is, some of you might know it already. It's a canonic graphic novel and work of for Holocaust remembrance in particular, and graphic novels in general. It is very well known, very popular, also a Pulitzer winner for this graphic novel, so it is quite the masterpiece of graphic novels in the field.
Okay, this is quite interesting that this genre of Holocaust-related graphic novels started evolving after the war, and that Maus really seemed to be a kind of trigger here, being such an important work in the field. Often the only work people know. Therefore, it's also interesting to see that there were predecessors which already influenced Spiegelman when he was creating Maus.
Totally. So Maus is, as you said, it's regarded to be one of the most important graphic novels of all times, regardless also of the Holocaust. It's just a very, very important graphic novel of its own. And the 2-volume graphic novel that is Maus portrays the relationship between Art Spiegelman and his Holocaust survivor father, Vladek Spiegelman, telling his and Art's mother, Anya, story and their experiences during the Holocaust, and mostly in Auschwitz. And Maus is very well known for its unique style, drawing all human beings as animals, portrayed as various kinds according to their ethnic and national identity, with Jews portrayed as mice, Germans as cats, Polish as pigs, etc. And Maus is also characterized by a prominent narrator, which is Art himself, and the telling of history by drawing his father's testimony. It is a truly fascinating graphic novel, which started as an intriguing 3-page story published in 1972 in Funny Animals.
So please read the 3-page mouse story in figures 11 to 13 in our visual folder, and look at the photograph from the liberation of Buchenwald, which is figure 14. So the first illustrations of this story received major scholarly attention. So as you just saw, Spiegelman drew the famous photograph by Margaret Burke-White from the liberation of Buchenwald, which shows liberated survivors standing behind a barbed wire fence as mice. So he was adapting it to the context of his graphic novel. And in this illustration, which is even more interesting, Art Spiegelman did not only adapt the photograph to the context of his imagination of the world of the concentration camps, but he also pointed towards a specific figure within this group and indicates it as his father. We see a small arrow and the inscription Papa there. So in this manner, Spiegelman, so to say, depicted his father's experience in Auschwitz by drawing this liberation photo as a kind of family photo, so to say, or using it as part of a family album, and thereby appropriating it into his family's memory, so replacing the non-existing photograph of his father in at this time.
Yeah, that's right. And literature scholar Marianne Hirsch developed the concept of post-memory in relation to this image, arguing that post-memory describes the relationship of the second generation to powerful, often traumatic experiences that preceded their births, but were nevertheless transmitted to them so deeply as to seem to constitute memories in their own right. Relying on the iconic visual imagery of the Holocaust, what she terms as visual tropes, Hirsch claims that post-memory is so powerful, and I quote, precisely because its connection to its object or source is mediated not through collection, but through representation, projection, and creation. And here we can see the connection to the family memory through the iconic image taken during liberation, which has no direct relation to Art Spiegelman, but is related through the work of post-memory by his son Art. And Hirsch argues that post-memory is a generational structure of transmission that is deeply embedded in forms of mediation, such as this illustration by Spiegelman. She claims that family life and also the second generation in general is entrenched in a collective imaginary shaped by public generational structures of fantasy and projection, and by a shared archive of stories and images that inflect the transmission of individual and familial remembrance.
Oh, that's really interesting that the theoretical concept is so closely related to a piece of art, and on the other hand, the piece of art so perfectly illustrating this theoretical concept. On the other hand, I think Maus is only one of many examples that show this work of post-memory, as Marianne Hirsch terms it, as an important kind of driving force within graphic novels. Please look at figures 15 and 16 in our visual folder.
We can see also other examples in the in other graphic novels that quite how can you say, resonate or have this kind of close connection to Hirsch and also to Maus. And one of them is The Second Generation, The Things I Didn't Tell My Father, by Israeli-Belgian artist Michel Kishka, which was also very much influenced by Maus. And he also inscribed the family memories into iconic photographs. And on page 9 of his novel, he draws his nightmares as a child to a Holocaust survivor, dreaming of his father's family fluttering as ashes throughout Europe, and his father as a corpse in Auschwitz. In this illustration, he utilizes other iconic images of the Holocaust, such as the Arbeit macht frei Auschwitz I gate sign, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Gate of Death train rails, a photo of Crematorium 3 taken by the SS, and an image of a corpse taken during the liberation of Bergen-Belsen in order to depict his nightmares as a child. And this way, we can see how the iconic imageries of the Holocaust are embedded amongst the second generation, appearing in their nightmares, in their creation, and first and foremost in their memory work.
Wow, yeah, that's really fascinating to see how it's condensed in this one page. Of course, there are many more other graphic novels which utilize iconic images of the Holocaust for the work of post memory. This seems really to be a very kind of very dominant technique, especially following what Art Spiegelman did in Maus. Yet we know that there are also other aspects evident in graphic novels of the Holocaust, not necessarily related to this iconic imagery of the Holocaust, right?
Yeah. And one of them is the adaptation of diaries to graphic novels, with a prominent one of being of Anne Frank. And while the diary of Anne Frank was adapted throughout the years in various media, such as cinema, theater, and podcasts, we find the adaptation to graphic novels especially interesting since it adapted her diary into a graphic form.
Please look at figure 16 in our visuals folder. I think that one of the most interesting adaptations made in recent years in this context is Ari Folman's and David Polonsky's graphic novel on Anne Frank, which we can see in this figure 16, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's a beautiful graphic novel. And this novel, which is also adapted to an animated film, and it's supposed to be released in the coming years, I think this year and the next one, it depicts some of Anne Frank's experiences and thoughts from her diary, joining the original text together with illustrations made by Polonsky. And this meeting point between the historical text and illustrations leaves much imagination for the reader to contemplate on the experiences of Anne Frank and her distinct character. And in general, we can, in this context, also elaborate on the unique form of comics and graphic novels and the way that they encourage participation and use of imagination. According to Scott McCloud, which is also a graphic novelist and an illustrator, the space in between images in comics, which is also known as the gutter, has an especially important meaning to the story. As he says, and I quote him, "Here in the limbo of the gutter, human imagination takes two separate images and transforms them into a single idea. Comic panels fractures both space and time, offering a jagged rhythm of unconnected moments. But closure allows us to connect these moments and mentally construct a continuous, unified reality." And this technique is very much apparent in the graphic novel of Anne Frank, as well as the challenging of this technique, which also further intensifies user participation. Let's take, for example, the ending frame of this graphic novel.
Please look at figure 17 in our visuals folder.
The ending frame does not portray Anne's capturing by the Nazis, but her complex figure in various expression, which keeps on resonating in the minds of her readers, imagining her fate subjectively.
So the field of graphic novels is very, very rich and creative in relation to the visual history of the Holocaust. And obviously we can even see that this is still evolving, right? There's no end of graphic novels on that topic.
Yeah, there's for sure no end, and it keeps on evolving. And actually we see that the language of comics is being used also in other new digital media forms of Holocaust commemoration, an interesting topic in itself. For example, the video game Attentat 1942 makes ample use of interactive comics.
Please look at video 1 in our visual folder.
It allows for an exploration of the experiences of survivors of the Nazi occupation, built on personal memories, comics, and authentic footage. The user in this game steps into the character of a grandchild, trying to understand what happened to his or her grandfather during the Holocaust, which is now hospitalized and cannot speak. The user conducts interviews with eyewitnesses, watches and interacts with their illustrated memories, and discovers the story of his or her grandfather. What we just watched is a segment from Auschwitz depicting one of the survivors' experience in camp. I think it is truly revealing the choice to use interactive comics in order to play. And in this case, we can regard it as the next step in the world of comics and graphic novels, as the user interacts with comics that encourages us not only use of imagination, but also provokes participation and creation.
Now, this is really interesting that we not only see that graphic novels have obviously an impact on the development of the aesthetic style of new media, but on the other hand, that this also goes together with creative or co-creative elements, right?
Yeah, most definitely. And it kind of like intertwines with the new digital media and technologies of the current era. So that's very fascinating. And perhaps when thinking about Kyle's preliminary definition of what graphic novels are, we can see that the use of the graphic in order to express a materialistic impression of an experience is relevant today as ever. New cultural and commemoration artifacts utilize the great qualities of graphic novels, their creative and innovative repertoire, challenging of conventional storytelling narratives into new forms, daring styles, and the ability to provoke use of imagination and creation in order to construct new memories and new stories regarding the memory of the Holocaust. And in this manner, they are truly genuine and extraordinary.
Wow, great. Thank you very much, Lital. That was a really fascinating insight into the relationship between graphic novels and Holocaust memory, which did not only kind of introduce this genre or medium of the graphic novel to us and explains why obviously there is this affinity between graphic novels and Holocaust memory, but also shows that this has an impact on new ecologies of Holocaust memory in the digital age. Thank you very much for this conversation and for sharing your research with us.
You're most welcome. It was my pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you in class.